So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on to this afternoon or evenings program, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Matt Schumann. I'm on the programming team here at Cary Library. Before we begin, please let me know in the chat if there's any technical issues that I can try to resolve. If you have any questions for our speaker, please use the Q&A. The chat is disabled except for getting in touch with the panelists, but I'd also like to thank the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation for helping make programs like tonight's possible. And I'd like to thank Lexington Living Landscapes and Massachusetts Pollinator Network. Today is a part of an ongoing series of presentations where the library is partnering with Lexington Living Landscapes and Massachusetts Pollinator Network to bring experts in landscape and conservation issues to the public. So now please welcome Rosemary Malfi.
Thank you very much, Matt. And hello, everyone. It's great to see all of you in this room. My name is Rosemary Malfi. I am the coordinator of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network, and it is very much my pleasure to welcome you all here this afternoon, or in the case of Dr. Goulson, this evening, as he is joining us from England. And first, I want to give a big thank you to Matt, Cary Library, and the Cary Library Foundation for hosting this presentation. And I want to acknowledge and thank the three organizations that are co-sponsoring this event: Lexington Living Landscapes, the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust, and Mass Audubon, which are all Massachusetts-based organizations working to conserve and restore wild spaces and biodiversity. For folks who may be unfamiliar, the Massachusetts Pollinator Network is a statewide grassroots initiative of the Northeast Organic Farming Association to connect and unite the many people and community groups that are working to improve pollinator health through habitat projects and policy reform to reduce pesticide use. And we are more powerful when we are all communicating and working with one another. So if you'd like to join us in our efforts, you can learn more about our program at our website, masspollinatornetwork.org. And now it is very much my honor, as both an advocate for insect life and a longtime student of bumblebee ecology in particular, to introduce our guest, Dr. Dave Goulson. Dr. Goulson is professor of biology at University of Sussex in England, specializing in bee ecology. He has published more than 350 scientific articles on the ecology and conservation of bumblebees and other insects, as well as 7 books, including A Sting in the Tail, The Garden Jungle, and most recently, Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse, which is a wonderful and moving book about insects and the challenges that we've imposed on them. Dr. Goulson founded the charity Bumblebee Conservation Trust in 2006, and in 2015, he was named number 8 in BBC Wildlife Magazine's list of the top 50 most influential people in conservation. Dr. Goulson, I'm so happy that you're here today. Thank you so much for joining us from afar, and the floor is yours.
Thanks, Rosemary. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a dark, wintry night where I'm sitting at the moment. Excellent. So I'm going to talk to you tonight primarily about insects, although I'll touch on lots of kind of broader issues about biodiversity and the environment. Insects are my kind of focus. I've been slightly obsessed by them since I was a little kid. I can't really explain why. You know, some kids are interested in trains or want to go into space or whatever. For me, I was always just completely fascinated by bugs, by creepy crawlies. I used to, when I was at primary school, I remember collecting caterpillars and putting them in my lunchbox and taking them home and trying to rear them up. And occasionally they survived and turned into beautiful butterflies and moths and so on. And actually, I think lots of kids, given half a chance, are like that. You know, they're really fascinated by little creatures. This is my son. It's my youngest son, a couple of years ago now, with his pet cockchafer, Colin. That's the cockchafer, not my son. And sadly, Colin's no longer with us. But anyway, but Seth, my son, is very much still in his bug phase, and I pray he never grows out of it. But the sad truth is that most people do. I think that most teenagers and adults, their reaction if an insect comes near them is usually one of fright. They flap around, they try and kill it because they think it's going to bite them, sting them, give them a disease. I'm not quite sure what they think, but they're frightened of these tiny little creatures, which makes very little sense when you think about it. And it's really sad. And this kind of disconnect from the natural world, I think is rather well captured by this photograph I scrounged off Twitter earlier this year. If you think you've suddenly become dyslexic, don't try and read the top half of the sign. It's in Welsh. But the bottom half, this was a sign that was out this summer it's on a university campus, the University of South Wales in Wales, obviously the west of Britain. Warning, flying insects in this area, run for your lives, big red sign suggesting that flying insects are something we should be terrified of, that you should perhaps not avoid going down this path in case you should encounter one of these terrifying creatures. It's rather sad, really, isn't it? Actually, all it was some flying ants, and I guess you get this in the eastern US in the summer. We often do in summer here. On a warm day, June, July, you get ant swarms where basically the young queens and males are produced and they fly off. Pretty much completely harmless. Why on earth this site? Anyway, you get my point. It's rather sad. And so I guess my mission in life is to try and persuade people to love insects, which it sometimes feels like an uphill task. Anyway, let me tell you a bit more about insects in case you're sitting on the fence about them. Let's just start at the beginning. There's so much I could tell you about the insect world. And it's very hard to know where to start. They've been around for a ridiculous amount of time. The first insects, we think, evolved about 480 million years ago, which doesn't mean much to most people, but it's roughly twice as long ago as the first dinosaurs, right? The beginning of life on land, on planet Earth. And they dominated that early world, and they still dominate today. In fact, they are, in terms of numbers of individuals and numbers of species, by far the dominant life force on our planet. They were the first creatures to make noises, the first creatures to sing on our planet, and the first creatures to take to the air, to fly. About 380 million years ago, flight evolved in insects, and they had the skies to themselves for about 170 million years. And back then there were higher oxygen concentrations in the atmosphere, so they were able to grow bigger than they can today. And we have fossils of these dragonfly-like creatures with a wingspan of about 2 feet. Must have been absolutely amazing. Sadly, long gone, but insects, because they've been here so long, they've had time to diversify incredibly. And we've so far named about 1.1 million species of insect, which makes up about 70% of all known species on our planet. But what's, I think, kind of most interesting and rather mind-boggling, really, is that it's estimated that there are perhaps 3, 4, 5 million more insects awaiting discovery. We haven't even identified half the insects on our planet, we think. New ones are discovered all the time. So who knows what else is out there, and the amazing lives and stories those creatures must have that we've yet to find out about. Lots of fun things to keep entomologists like me busy for a long time into the future. So insects are very diverse. They come in this extraordinary range of shapes and sizes and colors and so on. So I thought I'd start off, this is kind of childish really, but just showing you some pictures of some cool insects, starting with this amazing selection. Here we go. Let's start with the most successful family of creatures on the planet, the weevils. The weevils are a subset of the beetles. There are about 90,000 known species of weevil. These little tend to be quite small beetles with these rather charming curved snouts, sort of down curved, looks like a nose, but it's actually the head of the insect is kind of elongated. This particular one is the oak weevil. I don't think it's found as far as I know, it's not found in North America, but it's quite common in Europe. Then there are beautifully camouflaged insects. Insects are a favorite food of many larger creatures like birds and so on. So they go to great lengths to avoid being eaten. And one strategy is to be camouflaged. And you can see this is a gorgeous, it's a katydid, a bush cricket, pretending to be a leaf quite successfully, I would say. And then there are insects that are far from camouflaged. Although in a way this is an orchid mantis, which at the first glance might look like a flower, and that's presumably its intention because it's trying to lure pollinating insects to their death. It's a predator, and if any bee or whatever comes near, will be grabbed and consumed. Another strategy to avoid being eaten is to pretend to be an insect you're not. And this is quite confusing if you're trying to learn to identify insects, because there are lots of insects mimicking other insects. And in particular, lots of insects pretend to be bees or wasps, because bees and wasps have a sting. And quite a few predators don't like to tackle bees or wasps because they don't want to get stung. And so if you look like a bee or a wasp, then you get protection. So this thing in front of you, you probably at first glance would think was some kind of bumblebee. It's trying to look like a bumblebee, but actually it's a fly. It doesn't have a sting. It's completely harmless, has no defenses at all. But it's a pretty cool mimic. Then there are brightly colored insects that are advertising they're poisonous. I mentioned collecting caterpillars when I was a kid, and one of the creatures I used to collect is that one on the right there, cinnabar moth, which it gathers the poisons in the plants it feeds upon and stores them in its body and becomes itself poisonous. And then it advertises that it's poisonous with these bright yellow and black stripes. Anyway, so there are some insects that are just plain weird, and we have no idea why they look like they look. This is a little frog hopper from Central America, and it exudes these little strands of colored wax from its bottom and makes this kind of amazing array. It looks like an optic fiber or something. It's really odd. We have no idea why it's doing it, what the point is. It must have a function, and hopefully someday someone will work it out. And then just finally on my random selection of tour of the world's insects, there's even a bug that lives in Thailand, which looks quite like Elvis. Look at that. Anyway, so my speciality are bees, as I probably mentioned. I've spent the last 30 years studying bees of one sort or another. Bees are comparatively newcomers to the insect world. They've been around for a mere 120 million years, which still means they're older than Tyrannosaurus rex, for example. They evolved in the middle of the age of the dinosaurs. They actually evolved from wasps, solitary wasps. And essentially bees are kind of wasps turned vegetarian or vegan. They, instead of making a little nest and stocking it with paralyzed prey, the first bee, and this, by the way, in case you haven't realized, is a fossil bee from about 100 million years ago, trapped in amber. Amazing to think that that little insect that you're looking at was flying around in the world of dinosaurs. Anyway, so the ancestral bee, the first bee, instead of feeding its offspring on paralyzed insects, it started feeding them on pollen instead, which is a good source of protein. And that proved to be a successful strategy. And now there are 25,000 species of bee in the world. And just like the rest of the insects, they come in an extraordinary range of shapes and sizes and colors and so on. Anyway, you probably gathered insects are pretty cool and diverse, and they've been around for a very long time. They've survived the 5 mass extinction events in history, the most recent one of which wiped out the dinosaurs 65 million years ago. But now, sadly, insects are in trouble. We don't have good data for the majority of insects in terms of population censuses or long-term kind of population data. But we do for some insects and for some regions, and almost all the data we have is depressingly negative. One of the most dramatic lines of evidence we have for insect declines came from Germany. It was a study I was involved in peripherally, published in 2017. But based on years of work by insect enthusiasts in Germany who trapped insects using malaise traps. That thing top right is a malaise trap. It's intended to catches any type of flying insect. And the chart shows you the daily weight, the biomass of flying insects caught per day per trap from 1989 to 2016-17, period of 27 years or thereabouts. And you can see it fell. It actually fell on average by 76%, so seemingly 3/4 of the flying insects disappeared from Germany in a quarter of a century, which is pretty scary. And this got a lot of coverage around the world because of the scale of decline it seemed to suggest. So say we don't have similar data for that many other insect groups or regions. We do in the UK, we monitor butterflies quite carefully. Butterfly populations have halved since 1976. For bees, we don't have any kind of population census, but we have maps. And we can see from those that many species their ranges have contracted substantially. So here's a British example. This is a rather lovely little bumblebee, the shrill carder bumblebee, one of my favorites. Pre-1960, as you can see from that map on the left there, it was pretty widespread. It was a common insect 60 years ago in the UK. But as time went on, it's disappeared. By 2000, when I first became really focused on what was happening with bee declines, it was down to about 6 kind of core populations. I went looking for this bee, and at the time I was based in the south of England, and I went to Salisbury Plain, which is, I just put a circle around it. And I spent a whole summer looking for this insect, and I got really excited when I finally found one. But that population on Salisbury Plain has gone since then. And the one to the west of it, which is in a place called the Somerset Levels, around Glastonbury, if that means anything, it seems to be about to disappear. So this bee is going extinct before our eyes. It seems likely that it may be gone within a decade if it carries on as it is. Just one more example. I don't want to depress the heck out of you, but I thought I really ought to give you an American example. So this is perhaps a familiar one to many of you, the rusty-patched bumblebee. It's a beautiful bumblebee. There she is on the left there. Used to be the commonest bumblebee in eastern United States and Canada. One of the commonest insects you would have seen in your garden. You would have not just 1 or 2 of them, but dozens of them on a summer's day 30 years ago. But it started a really rapid decline in 1995. And is now exceedingly rare in most of the United States. There are very few places where you can regularly see them. It's estimated that this bee has declined by at least 99.9% in 27 years, which is pretty terrifying. And again, you know, it's no great leap to see that this species could easily go extinct. I should have explained, of course, the little round browny purple or whatever reddish dots are older records, pre 2000, and the yellow ones are more recent records, and they're based on a lot of people looking for this bee, and they haven't found terribly many, sadly. Anyway, so insects are in trouble, and that should bother us. I think a summary as to why that should bother us was I can't put it better than E.O. Wilson put it a few years ago. I won't read out his whole quote. I'm sure you've heard of him. He sadly died last year, but he's a very famous American biologist, and he was an insect specialist. Ants were his real love. And he basically said if people were to disappear, the planet would do really well without us. But if insects were to vanish, as he put it, the environment would collapse into chaos. And I think it's worth running through why he said that and why I would agree with him. So why are insects? Why does it matter if insects disappear? Most people, as I said earlier, don't like insects. Some people quite cheered by the idea of a world without any insects in it. But that, if that's what you think, then it shows a rather poor understanding of their importance. So I've already mentioned they make up the bulk of biodiversity on our planet, about 70% of all known species. They're food for a big proportion of the remainder of species. So most birds eat insects either all their life or when they're chicks, along with a lot of other animals like bats and lots of reptiles, lizards, amphibians, lots of freshwater fish like trout and salmon, all eat insects. So if the insects go, then so will they. But insects do a lot more aside from being lunch. They're involved in more or less every kind of ecological process you can think of. For example, they recycle cowpats, things like the dung beetle, top right there, along with dung flies and a host of other insects. And they get rid of dead bodies very efficiently, things like the carrion beetle, which is the red and black one, helped out by blowflies and lots of other insects. And they're vital predators of crop pests, helping to keep numbers of pest insects under control. They help to keep the soil healthy, they distribute seeds, and so on and so on. And most of this, people have no idea about. They're completely oblivious. But there is one thing that insects do, of course, which I think the majority of people now do appreciate, and that's this pollination, of course. Many people mistakenly think pollination is all done by bees. Some people think it's all done by honeybees, which is just one of the 25,000 species of bee. It's not. Pollination is done by thousands of species of insect, not just the bees, but butterflies, moths, loads of different flies, beetles, wasps, and so on. And between them, they pollinate. It's about 80% of all plant species on the planet rely upon insect pollinators. So if there aren't enough pollinators, that means that plants are going to stop producing seeds and ultimately disappear. And of course, there's a direct human relevance here, that roughly 3/4 of the crops we grow in the world wouldn't give a full harvest without insect pollinators. And that includes basically most fruit and veg. So we've become used to our shops being rammed with amazing selection of fruits and vegetables from all over the world for 12 months of the year. It wouldn't look so good if you took away the insect pollinators. It'd be much lower harvests in many of these crops. And we're talking about everything from sort of apples and cherries, strawberries, blueberries, raspberries, squashes, tomatoes, pumpkins, chili peppers. I could go on and on. I won't bore you. But even coffee and chocolate depend upon insect pollinators. So, life would be dire indeed if we didn't have these little creatures. And we need to make sure we don't end up like these people who might look quite happy in the pictures, but what they're doing is rather sad. So these people, this is southwest China, an area where there's huge extent of apple and pear orchards, which are now pollinated by hand because there aren't enough insects to pollinate them. So the people, the farmers and their children go into the orchards in the spring and clamber about, send their children up to the higher branches with little pots of pollen and paintbrushes, and they hand pollinate all the flowers. I mean, it looks quite sweet, doesn't it, when they're doing it in their traditional dress? And it's a really high value crop, this, and labor in China is cheap. So this is just about viable. But imagine a farmer in the Western world hand pollinating his canola field. It's not really going to work. So you can make a pretty compelling argument that our lives would be much worse off, much harder, if we didn't have insects. They deliver all these, what scientists sometimes rather dryly call ecosystem services. But I've trotted this argument out hundreds and hundreds of times. And it's true, but there's something that increasingly worries me about this argument, which it doesn't really capture, I don't think, why I care about insects and the most powerful reasons for looking after insects. Well, there are two things. Firstly, I don't care about insects because they pollinate stuff and look after the soil and recycle cowpats. I care for insects because I think they're amazing. They're cool, they're beautiful, and the world would be a sadder place if they weren't here. And also the sort of economic argument for insects probably doesn't apply to quite a lot of the insect world. And let me give you an example. So this is the St. Helena giant earwig. It was the biggest earwig that ever lived. It was about 3 inches long, an absolute whopper of an earwig. As you might guess, it lived on St. Helena, which is a little tiny island in the South Atlantic. It's been extinct now for 30, 40, 50 years. We're not exactly sure. It used to live in seabird colonies. It was probably exterminated by rats that we accidentally introduced to the island. So the world's biggest earwig is gone. It disappeared without any ecological catastrophe unfolding. It wasn't doing anything that needed to be done. And yeah, it seems to me that the world is a sadder place for not having a giant earwig. And I would argue that the giant earwig had a right to live, it had a right to survive. It's probably been around for millions of years. And what right did we have to wipe it out carelessly by accidentally introducing rats to the island? And likewise, there must be millions of other insects that I suspect we could do without, but the world would be a sadder place if they weren't here. And I think we need to learn to respect the rest of life on our planet and not just look after the ones that we need, but actually look after all of them. It seems to me we should have kind of animal rights in the same sense that we have human rights. Anyway, I'm probably rambling slightly. If we're going to look after insects, I guess we need to briefly touch on why they're declining before we talk about what we can do about it. So I'm just going to spend 10 minutes talking about the main reasons for insect declines. There are lots of them, as I describe in Silent Earth, if you want more detail. Loss of habitat is still probably globally the biggest driver of insect declines, but there are lots of others, things like pesticide use, which I'll talk a bit more about, spread of diseases, which may be the driver of the rusty patch bumblebee decline, climate change is starting to kick in, and so on and so on. It's like a perfect storm of factors that we've created. And I should say, actually, I mean, of course, insects, they're pretty tough. You know, they've survived 500 million years nearly. So it's quite remarkable that we've managed to have such a big impact on them. But it's because I think we've thrown so many, you know, they could probably cope with climate change if that was the only thing. They might be able to cope with pesticides if that was the only thing. But if you simultaneously poison them, take away their food, take away their habitat, and so on, then perhaps we shouldn't be surprised that they can't cope. Anyway, I'll say a little bit more about some of these, starting with loss of habitat, which, I mean, the biggest driver of that is the spread of intensive farming around the world. And I don't know where this picture was taken, but it could be almost anywhere in the world. We've increasingly removed the natural ecosystem, the natural biodiversity from areas, completely stripped it away and replaced it with big monocultures of crops. And of course, we need to feed everybody. We need to grow lots of food. There's a growing human population. But we should be aware that the way we're feeding people is having huge impacts on the environment. The biodiversity in this kind of farmland is close to zero. And I'll come back to that later. So that obviously has a big impact. And we're still clearing rainforests to plant oil palm and soybean and cattle ranches and so on. Inevitably a big driver of insect declines. Associated with intensive farming is high levels of use of pesticides. We're currently globally using about 3 million tons a year, and the amount of pesticides applied and the frequency of spraying goes up on average every year. And this includes a whole range of products, but they're all essentially poisons of one type or another, intended to kill either insects or weeds, or sometimes slugs and snails, or fungi are the main fungicides, are the main different types of pesticides, although many of them are unfortunately toxic to a broad range of organisms. There's a lot of collateral damage in using these chemicals. Thankfully, in Europe, we don't do this, but in the Americas and other parts of the world, you guys allow a slightly less targeted pesticide applications, dumping them from aeroplanes, which, I mean, you can see from this picture, it means they drift in the wind and they'll get into, they won't necessarily stay in the crop. The situation in the developing world is also very sad. I took this picture in India, just outside Calcutta a couple of years ago, and this guy is applying herbicide with the most ancient equipment. Is some sort of brass hand pump attached to that plastic can is slung around his neck. It was dripping everywhere. He's got no gloves on. He hasn't even got shoes on. And the stuff he's using was paraquat, which is pretty toxic to people. It's been banned in Europe, although it's still allowed in North America, I believe. Anyway, just to give you one example of the global scale of the pesticide problem, this map is from a study published by a Swiss research group, and they were interested in a particular group of insecticides called neonicotinoid insecticides that some of you might have heard of. There's been a lot of evidence accumulated that they're certainly contributing to declines of insects, particularly bees. They're really potent neurotoxic insecticides. They attack the brain of the insect, and it's kind of like Novichok for bees, really. It takes a few billionths of a gram of this stuff to kill a honeybee. Anyway, what this map shows you, so each of the little circles, the little blobs, forget the pie chart bits, the little rings, each of those is a honey sample from somewhere in the world. And they analyzed them for these neonicotinoid pesticides. And to cut a long story short, 75% of honey samples from around the world contain varying levels of a really potent toxin that kills bees. So 3/4 of the world's honeybees are being poisoned, including most of the ones in the United States from the look of that map. Although there is a white dot not so far from you guys. Anyway, I mean, and this isn't just about honeybees. The honeybees are being exposed by visiting contaminated flowers and drinking the nectar. Well, if honeybees are being exposed, that means every other pollinating insect, all the other thousands of species, are also being exposed to insecticide, really potent insecticide. That can't be good. It's all rather sad, isn't it? Anyway, let's move on from pesticides. I will actually come back to them briefly later, but I just wanted to talk about one final driver of insect declines, which is much less well appreciated or discussed, and that's light pollution. We all know that we've seen these satellite photos of Earth from space, and the amount of light we produce at night goes up by about 2% every year. The world is kind of lit up like a Christmas bauble viewed from space. And this sadly has consequences for nocturnal insects. Most obviously, it disorientates flying insects like moths at night, and they fly round and round in circles around bright lights and bash themselves to death and get caught by bats and spiders and so on, which obviously isn't good for them. But actually, the more serious consequences of light pollution are probably more to do with disrupting the timing of the life cycle of insects. There have been some really interesting studies published in recent years showing that if an insect is living in a place where there are lights on at night, it can misjudge the length of the day and think it's springtime and time to emerge from hibernation when actually it's still the middle of winter. And obviously that's catastrophic. And also there's a really interesting study on African dung beetles. Some species of dung beetle, when they're rolling their balls of dung, they navigate by the light of the Milky Way, and that milky line of billions of stars across the night sky. But if there's light pollution nearby, they can't detect the Milky Way, and they go all over the place with their dung balls and get lost, poor things. Okay, enough doom and gloom for the moment. So insects are in decline. That's bad because they're really important and rather lovable. And it's being driven by lots of things, some of which we can do something about. So how do we fix this? What can we do to turn around insect declines? Well, I mean, broadly, actually, there's a lot of good news here. Most insect species haven't gone extinct, and they can recover really quick if we just give them somewhere to live, stop killing them, whatever. Unlike rhinos or pandas or whatever, an insect population can spring back in a few months, a few years, if we just look after them. And because insects live everywhere on the planet, more or less, apart from the sea, they live in our gardens, our local parks, and so on. We can all get involved in doing stuff to look after them. And I think that's really exciting and empowering. So I'm going to talk about three broad areas. These are huge topics, and I can't do justice to any of them really in the time I've got this evening. But so forgive me if particularly the farming section is ridiculously short. But anyway, that's what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the talk, these three areas, starting with farming. So I've already said industrialized farming, big monocultures with lots of pesticides, is pretty disastrous for biodiversity. But you might think it's a necessary evil, that we have to have it because there's 8 billion of us, and there's going to be 10 billion of us quite soon. And surely people not starving is more important than worrying about a few insects. I think, actually, I'm not sure many people really think about this issue at all, but I think many that do might accept that argument that industrialized farming is necessary. I fear that it's just not sustainable, and that actually people will starve in the future, perhaps not too distant future, if we carry on down this route. And there's a number of reasons to justify that. Well, firstly, so there's three key reasons exemplified by three pictures here. So starting top left, the one I've already talked about, industrialized farming is having huge impact on biodiversity, yet it depends upon biodiversity. It needs the pollinators, it needs the dung beetles, and so on and so on. It needs all these creatures to help to control crop pests. So it's undermining its own basis. And in fact, there was a study published just last week, if I remember correctly, which estimated that so there's already evidence that crop yields globally are starting to fall because of inadequate pollination. Not by much. The global average is somewhere between 3 and 5%, which doesn't sound like very much, but they estimated that is enough to already be causing about 500,000 excess deaths a year through poor diet, because there is less fruit and vegetables available to people because of falling bee numbers. And that problem is going to get a lot worse if insects continue to decline while the human population continues to rise. Anyway, so farming is wiping out the very creatures it needs to be successful. It's also damaging soil. There was a recent study from the United Nations, a report published by the United Nations, estimating about 40% of the world's soils are badly degraded. We've lost carbon from soils around the world, and a lot of soil life is much more scarce than it used to be. And obviously we need soil if we're going to grow crops into the future. What are our children and our grandchildren going to grow their food in if we don't leave them any soil? It takes tens of thousands of years to regenerate. And then polar bears are there to remind me that sadly, industrialized farming contributes nearly a third of all greenhouse gas emissions, which we know we need to stop. And again, is undermining the conditions it requires to be successful. So basically, I think we can't just keep going down ever more intensive farming with more and more chemical inputs, as we have done for the last 80 years. We need to find a new way forward. So how do we do that? Well, I think it helps to sort of step back and think, okay, what do we want from a farming system? What would the perfect food production system look like? I mean, I think broadly it needs to be one that works with nature rather than against it, which perhaps sounds a bit glib, but I think that really captures the essence of what we need. It needs to look after soil. We have to ensure that future generations have soil to grow their food in. It needs to ensure that they also have pollinators and ladybirds and beetles that predate slugs and all the other natural enemies that are really important, which basically means we need to stop poisoning them all with pesticides, I think, or at least massively reduce pesticide use. And of course, whatever system you come up with needs to produce enough food, and ideally a much more diverse and healthy diet than we have at present. I could talk at length about this, but I'll spare you. But at the moment we grow more grain and oil in the world than we need by far, but nowhere near enough fruit and veg to give everyone a healthy diet. And so I think we should be moving to more diversified farming, where farmers are growing way more crops. Many farmers, certainly in Europe, grow just 2 or 3 different crops on big areas of land these days. And I think there's a really good argument for diversifying into farmers growing maybe 10, maybe 20 different crops on their land with long rotations. It would greatly enhance the opportunities for biodiversity at the same time. Anyway, there are some really cool and exciting things going on in the world of farming that I haven't got time to talk to you about. If you're interested in this kind of thing, you'll already be aware of many of them. Things like agroforestry schemes, which are trying to put perennial crops like trees and shrubs into big fields to break them up and hold the soil together and provide more niches for biodiversity to survive and so on. Organic farming, which obviously does away with the pest, or most at least of the pesticides. I think if we take the best elements of all of the great things that are happening and give it some financial support, some research and development funding, we can come up with a way of producing food which is both productive and sustainable in the long term. Anyway, I haven't got time to say any more about farming. I'm going to move on to number 2 of my things we can do for insects, which is rewilding. Basically setting aside land for nature. Rewilding it's become a controversial topic in Europe. I don't know what it's like in North America. I am a firm, I've already mentioned Ed Wilson. He's kind of a hero of mine. And he wrote a book called Half Earth, and I'm with him completely. I think we should set aside half the earth for wildlife. Perhaps that's fanciful, but anyway. So rewilding means different things to different people. To me, it's about restoring missing parts of ecosystems and then basically stepping back and letting nature do its thing. And I first came across the concept of rewilding in the example of Yellowstone National Park, which may be very familiar to some of you. I'll give you in case you're not familiar with it, I'll give you the short version of what I understand happened there. I've never had the chance to go myself. But basically, it's a huge national park. And it was in a pretty poor ecological state. Relatively recently, we're going back about 20 or 30 years. It was overrun with elk, a huge population overgrazing the land. There was bare soil erosion. There were no trees regenerating because the little saplings just got eaten as soon as they germinated. It was a mess. And the decision was taken to reintroduce wolves in the hope that it would reduce the elk population. The wolves were naturally had lived there, but they'd been hunted out. And the wolves had, so the story goes, a remarkably positive effect on the whole ecosystem, not so much by reducing the elk population, which they did a little bit, but there were only a few dozen wolves in total. But they changed the behavior of the elk. The elk started becoming nervous and keeping in open areas where they could see the wolves coming, and they avoided steep-sided riverbanks in particular, where it was easy to get trapped, which meant that the grazing pressure along the rivers was greatly reduced, which meant trees started to regenerate, which provided more food for beavers. So the beaver population rebounded and started making lots of dams, which created more aquatic habitat, and so on. And this is the short version. But anyway, basically the reintroduction of a missing top predator, the wolf, seemed to have a huge kind of cascade of benefits for the ecosystem. Things are a bit different in a European context, where, particularly in the UK, we've lost all of our top predators. We have no wolves, no bears, no lynx, nothing bigger than a fox, sadly. And we've also lost most of the herbivores as well. Actually, America lost most of its large herbivores when the first humans colonized. You used to have amazing creatures wandering around the Great Plains, things like camels, all sorts of llama-like creatures, long-legged pigs, and Lord knows what else. But anyway, that's a story for another day. Anyway, in Europe, we've lost things like the auroch, which was a giant cow species that used to graze the land. And so we've lost important species that probably played a really key role in supporting biodiversity. Today, if you leave a piece of Britain, if you abandon it, you rewild it and just walk away, it'll turn into dense woodland. But actually that isn't particularly biodiverse. And it's now widely believed that the disturbance created by having big grazing animals, only 100,000 years ago, we had elephants wandering around Britain, knocking over trees, grazing, browsing, digging wallows, and so on. That disturbance is really key to biodiversity. So the rewilding projects in Europe are mostly about putting back the big herbivores, or at least some of the big herbivores that we can. And forgive me, this is not directly relevant to Massachusetts in the slightest, but there's a lovely rewilding project close to where I live, which I just like to tell you a tiny bit about, because it's a big success story that's really captured the imagination of people in the UK. And it's very different to Yellowstone, because this rewilding project was on intensive farmland. It was land that was being farmed very heavily by the owners until just over 20 years ago. But it wasn't very profitable farming. The soil isn't very fertile. It's a 3,500 acre estate, which by British standards is huge. But it was struggling to break even financially, even with farm subsidies, because basically the land was not very fertile. And so they took the controversial decision to rewild, to set it aside for nature, for carbon capture, for tourism, rather than food production. I say controversial because some people think that land must be farmed, that we have a kind of duty to farm the land, and to allow it to go wild is somehow wrong, which is kind of weird, I think. Anyway, so this place is called Knepp. It actually has a castle, as you can see there, at the center of the estate. Basically what they did was they put a big fence around the whole area, took out all the internal fences and barriers, chucked in some old breeds of cow and pig that would take the place, sort of substitute for the missing giant auroch cows that we used to have and the wild boar that we used to have. They introduced ponies from Exmoor, which are a substitute for the wild tarpan, the wild horses that used to live in Europe. And they step back and they then just see what happens. Let nature do its thing. And it's really cool, because in 20 years, it's gone from the most boring farmland with virtually nothing in it at all to an area that's oh, sorry, I forgot to say they also chucked in some beavers and some storks. Rather sweet. It's now teeming with nature, with life, with insects and things that like to eat insects in particular. Things like the nightingale, bottom right, which is famous for its song, and which is a really rare and rapidly declining bird in Britain, but which is thriving and increasing at this rewilding site, along with the cuckoo there on bottom left, which is a specialist in eating moth caterpillars. And there's a couple of butterflies there, which are not species you'll be familiar with, but top left there is a gorgeous butterfly we call the purple emperor, Again, very rare, but now this rewilding project has the biggest population in Britain from a standing start of none 22 years ago. So it's been a real success, and it seems to me that we need to set aside more land for nature. We can't set it all aside, but if we target the least productive farmland, places where farming only survives because of perverse subsidies, then that seems like a reasonable option, because it's not just about biodiversity. I've already mentioned it also helps to capture carbon as the trees grow and the soil recovers and so on. And the net estate is visited by hundreds of thousands of people a year. So it's also great for tourism, for recreation, and for re-engagement, connecting people with nature, which strikes me as pretty important these days. Okay. So that we've done farming, we've done rewilding briefly, and finally, a topic that's perhaps more relevant to most of us, because sadly, most of us don't have a 3,500 acre estate or a farm, but we might well have a garden. And I think actually there's real potential to do a lot in a garden, and to collectively turn, if we all do something in our gardens, to turn our urban areas into insect diversity hotspots, which would be really cool, both in supporting nature, but also in bringing about a world where our kids can grow up familiar with the sight of butterflies and bumblebees buzzing around in their backyard. I don't have figures for the US, but in Britain, which is a pretty small country, we have about 20 million private gardens, and they cover about 1 million acres of land, which is a bigger area than all of our nature reserves. So my kind of dream is to try and get everyone on board wildlife friendly gardening right across the country, and also to get the local authorities, the councils on board, so that the local parks and the cemeteries and the road verges and the roundabouts are all full of wildflowers and full of nature. And that would make a network of wildlife friendly habitat right across the country, Europe, North America, wherever. That's the dream anyway. I get quite excited about this. I've written books about it. They're probably a little bit European centric, so you might not want to buy them. But anyway, people think of gardening as a green activity. But actually, gardening can be both good or bad, depending on how it's done. And we should be aware, if we're gardeners, that there are really harmful options available to gardeners. It's possible to make a garden that's almost completely devoid of biodiversity, and that has a huge negative environmental footprint. So this garden has plastic grass, one of my pet hates. I could rant at length about the evils of plastic grass. I'll spare you because I've only got 10 minutes left. Anyway, awful stuff. You can even in the UK, I don't know whether this is a thing in Massachusetts, that is a plastic hedge, believe it or not. People are buying plastic hedges to put next to their plastic lawn. How awful is that? I'm guessing probably most of you that are tuned in haven't got a plastic hedge. I hope not. But probably all of us are guilty of slightly less obvious harms in our gardening, if we're gardeners. Many people's idea of gardening is to go to a garden centre at the weekend and get a trolley and fill it with annual bedding plants grown in disposable plastic pots, probably in a peat-based compost, a peat carbon-rich substance ripped from a peat bog, probably grown with lots of chemicals. They might buy some Roundup to control the weeds, some bug spray to control the bugs, some fertilizer to sprinkle all over their flowers and pollute the soil, and so on. You can see what I'm saying. Basically, gardening can be really bad for the environment, or it can be really, really good. And there's this amazing example that illustrates how good it can be from Leicester, which is a rather drab town in North Midlands of the United Kingdom. But there was a lady who lived there called Jenny Owen, who spent 35 years cataloguing in great detail every species she could find of insect, plant, bird, whatever, in her little garden. It was only about 1/8 of an acre, so it wasn't a big garden at all. And her species list after 35 years was 2,673, if I remember correctly. Nearly 2,000 of those were types of insect. But I think that's just amazing, 2,500 species living in a little urban garden. It just goes to show that, we could all have incredible biodiversity living right under our noses if we just do a few things to encourage it. So what are those things? Well, there's a lot, and I haven't got time to go into them all because I've got 7 minutes left before my allotted hour runs out. But so a few key things. Wherever possible, plant native species. There have been a number of scientific studies that show that native plants tend to attract more pollinating insects on average. There are some great non-natives, but wherever you can, grow a native plant and you will attract more pollinators, but you will also, and this is the really important bit, you will attract more herbivorous insects, things like butterflies that have caterpillars that are very specific in what they will eat. And they will only eat a native plant. Non-natives are more or less useless for most herbivorous insects. So to give you a British example, in my garden, I grow this plant on the bottom right, lady's smock, because it's the food plant of the orange-tip butterfly. And I have a little breeding population of these beautiful butterflies living in my back garden. A more familiar example for you guys is the monarch butterfly. Its caterpillars will only eat some species of milkweed plant. And if you grow those, if you're really lucky, you might get monarchs breeding in your garden. If you don't grow milkweeds, then you can absolutely guarantee that they won't be able to breed in your garden. So grow native plants wherever you can. I think actually that might be a non-native milkweed, unfortunately, in that picture. I'm not 100% sure, but I think that might be a Mexican milkweed. So actually that's not what you want to be growing. Luckily, I managed to find the Xerxes Society publish various guides to the native milkweeds, and there's different guides for different parts of the US. The nearest I could find to Massachusetts was Washington, which is probably close enough. But anyway, check out the Xerxes Society website if you want to know which milkweeds are the right ones for your part of the world. And more broadly, I think we should learn to be more tolerant of native weeds. Now, this slide these are native weeds in my garden. These would be non-native weeds if they were in your garden. So I'm not encouraging you to grow these things. But in Britain, these are plants that are often demonized, that people spray them with herbicide, but they're native plants, they're beautiful plants here, and they're really important for wildlife. And likewise, I mean, the milkweed, the native milkweed is a good example of a plant in North America that's really important for wildlife, and yet has declined greatly because it's seen as a weed, it's seen as undesirable. So don't persecute your native weeds, instead try to encourage them. There's a lovely project in East London trying to highlight the diversity of plants living in cracks in the pavement. There's a lady called Sophie LeGill who took to chalking the names, identifying as many species as she could, and then chalking their names next to them so that people walking along would stop and say, "Oh, I'd never really looked at these things before. Isn't that cool? There's some shepherd's purse, there's daisy, there's Herb Robert," and hopefully some of those passers-by will have appreciated something they'd never actually paid any attention to previously. Instead, what you often see, rather sadly, in urban areas in Europe, and I suspect in North America, is this kind of thing. The local councils often employ people to drive around the streets looking for anything green and spraying it with herbicide. So they usually Roundup with active ingredient glyphosate. So that was a bit of grass, probably not very biodiverse, but there might have been a few insects living in there. I'm sure there were. Now it's dead. It looks awful, I think. I mean, was that really necessary? It just seems like mindless vandalism to me. There's a more sinister side to this, of course, which you're probably aware of, which is the chemical that's often used in our streets pavements. I've seen this being sprayed on play equipment in children's parks. Roundup based on glyphosate, there's pretty clear evidence that it causes cancer in people. Do we really want to be spraying this in our streets? I should say that evidence is disputed by Monsanto that manufacture it, of course. But nonetheless, there's sufficient evidence that I would not want to be using that stuff in my garden or where my children play or where my dog goes. And I would suggest you don't want to either, really. Personally, I would just ban pesticide use in gardens and by the council in urban areas. We don't need them. You can make an argument that pesticides are vital for food production in farmland, and I'd argue with that too, but we just don't need them in our streets and our parks and our gardens. France banned pesticides for urban use in 2018, and France is still standing. Paris is still there. If Paris can be pesticide free, Boston could be pesticide free, London could be pesticide free. There's just no need. I did check out, there's a little organization, his name I can't read because it says you are screen sharing on top of it, but at the top there is the web address of the organization that produced this website, which there's just a list on screen there of local initiatives to reduce or eliminate pesticide in mainly urban areas in Massachusetts. So there's some really cool stuff going on locally, and if nothing's going on in your town or wherever you live, then maybe you should start your own campaign to get pesticides banned in our towns. On the subject of pesticides, I haven't quite finished. You may be an organic gardener who wouldn't dream of spraying pesticides in your own garden, but there are two little issues I wanted to flag up before I finish. One is that you might still accidentally bring lots of pesticides into your garden by buying pretty plants in your local garden centre. We recently published a study where we tested the plants. We particularly tested plants that were being sold as pollinator friendly, perfect for pollinators, bee friendly, with little logos on the labels. We tested them for pesticides, and these beautiful plants on sale in your local garden centre have mostly been drenched in insecticides to keep them looking perfect before they go on sale, which is kind of sad, isn't it? The other thing to be aware of is that if you have a dog or cat, your vet might encourage you to drip insecticide on the back of its neck every month. The products they recommend are incredibly poisonous insecticides. The one on the left there, Advocate, the active ingredient is one of those neonicotinoid insecticides, and the dose you're supposed to put on a dog every month is enough to kill 60 million honeybees. And this is a really potent and persistent pesticide. It's water soluble, so it washes off the dog, and the water either goes down the drain or the dog goes for a swim in a river, and you've got a huge dose of insecticide going down the river. We recently tested English rivers and found that 100% of them had one or both of these insecticides from dog flea treatments swirling around in them, which can't be helping. Okay, I'm going to skip a couple of slides about lawns and not mowing them so much, just because I feel I've done my hour. To wrap up, I think we actually need to try and rewild ourselves a bit if we can. We need to reconnect with nature. We certainly need to get over this urge to kill and control everything, and instead try to respect and love nature and realize that we're part of it, that our survival into the future depends upon a healthy environment. We are not apart from nature. We need it one way or another, both for practical reasons and for the joy it gives us. We often forget that we live on this little rock hurtling through space. It's the most extraordinary thing, really. It's unique. There really is no planet B. Whatever Elon Musk thinks, we aren't going to be jetting off to live on Mars anytime soon. We're one of the life forms clinging to the surface of this little rock. It's amazing. It should be our most valued possession, and I don't understand why we've been so reckless with it. But we have to do better, and what better place to start than by looking after all the little insects that live all around us. Before I finish, just if you want more information, check out my YouTube site or my books or whatever, or fire away for the Q&A that's following this. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you so very much. Wonderful talk and wonderful message. Cheers. We do have a number of questions that have already been asked. Folks, you are welcome to put a question into the Q&A. If you put it in the chat, we won't see it. So make sure you get it into the Q&A function. We do have a number of people that are part of this presentation tonight, so I'm not going to be able to get to everyone's question, but I will do my very best. Okay, so I think one of the first questions that came in was about aerial spraying, and I don't know about the similarities between where you are and here, but in Massachusetts, the state has control over aerial spraying, and they use pyrethroids. I think the one that we have is simethrin, and then it has a compound in it that also suppresses the immune system of the insects. And so I think the question is, what is the impact of that potentially on the diversity and abundance of our local insects?
So pyrethroid insecticides are really poisonous to insects. They kill all insects, not just the ones that are targeted. They're also really poisonous to fish if they get into fresh water. They have one slight advantage over some other pesticides in that they're not that persistent. They tend to break down fairly quickly, so they won't be there for weeks or months after they've been sprayed, unlike those neonicotinoids I mentioned. But broadly, I mean, I'm not sure where these aerial sprays are happening. Are we talking over urban areas or farmland? Sorry, you're muted, I think.
Oh, they're both.
Both, okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just incredibly thankful that this doesn't happen in Europe. Aerial spraying isn't allowed because it's considered too indiscriminate. It must be incredibly frustrating if you're trying to encourage wildlife in your garden and someone sprays your garden with insecticide. That would be the most disheartening of experiences, and I think you should be asking for that to stop. I can't see any other way of minimizing the damage.
Just as a quick aside for anyone for whom that is a big issue, NOFA Mass is a big driver of ecological mosquito control, along with a lot of partner organizations. So feel free to Google Mosquito, and you'll find a lot of resources there about advocacy. Someone else also has a question that comes up all the time, which is about glyphosate and Roundup and its use for invasives control, right? So invasive species are a problem, but also Roundup is a problem. Kind of how do we balance that? And is it a useful tool in that context?
Yeah, that is really tricky, and we have the same problems here. Roundup is sometimes used on nature reserves to control invasive plants. I wish I could recommend an entirely benign but equally convenient way of controlling weeds. There isn't one, I don't think. I do think we need to be aware sometimes of sort of demonizing non-native plants. There are sometimes wild exaggerations about how dangerous some of these plants are. I'm not sure if you have Japanese knotweed in the United States, for example, but it's a big problem here, and people are terrified of it. There are stories that it can burrow through concrete and your house will fall down if any grows near it, and crazy stuff, none of which is really true. It's just a plant at the end of the day. And so sometimes, I think we need to keep the risks in proportion, but there are some invasive plants that are really serious weeds, and perhaps with great reluctance, I would admit that there might be situations where very careful use of glyphosate painted onto the plant, for example, might be the best option. But I wish I could suggest an alternative.
Yes, yeah. It's really, I appreciate you offering your perspective on that. A question that I actually had after reading your book is about bans on neonicotinoids. So I feel like there's sort of a division in the advocacy community about bans on neonics or specific compounds, because there's a concern that if we did that farmers would revert to using something worse, like we're back to organophosphates, which are very toxic to humans, or that something worse would come along. So just from a sort of policy and political standpoint, do you think those bans are still very much worth pursuing?
Yeah, I mean, so Europe banned neonicotinoids more or less entirely in 2018, and the pesticide industry, in its lobbying against those bans, forecast there would be huge crop yield decreases if neonics were banned, which just didn't materialize at all. They said the same things, that farmers would be forced to use organophosphates instead. Well, they're not allowed to. They've been banned, so that isn't an option. So I personally, I think it was a good thing, but there is an issue that new generations of insecticides are coming in, some of which are suspiciously similar to neonicotinoids, and you know, it feels a bit like we're just going around in circles. You know, it happens time and time again that pesticides somehow get through the regulatory process. We're told they're safe, and it takes 20 or 30 years for enough evidence to accumulate that they're harmful. I mean, glyphosate has been on the market now for nearly 50 years. Neonicotinoids in Europe, it took about 20 years before they were banned. The organophosphates were another example, you know, but we keep making the same mistake. Every time a new chemical comes along, everyone thinks it's going to be fine. It somehow slips through the net, and eventually we find it's not fine. The only solution is to reduce pesticide use overall and move away from seeing a pesticide as the sort of first solution, the first port of call. Whenever there's a pest problem, just reach for the spray gun. There are far better ways of doing it, and I think that's the answer, not banning one pesticide at a time, because it's just like playing whack-a-mole. There's always another one.
Yeah, thank you for answering that. There were kind of two questions that came in about specific bumblebee species. One is about a rusty patch bumblebee here in North America. One is about the shrill carder bumblebee. And I think the questions in both cases are, what precipitated the decline of those species? Is there one factor that sort of prevailed?
Yeah, so for the shrill carder, it was almost certainly loss of habitat, particularly loss of, we used to have lots of flowery hay meadows, beautiful habitat that was essentially created. It was a man-made habitat created by grazing animals and cutting for hay over hundreds of years, which used to be everywhere in Britain 100 years ago, but the 20th century, we pretty much wiped it out. It was all ploughed up, and that flower-rich habitat was where those shrill carders lived. The rusty patch one is harder to answer. I think it was very likely a European bee disease. It's quite a long story, and I haven't got time for the full tale, but basically people breed bumblebees commercially to pollinate tomatoes in glasshouses, and this trade started in Europe, the North America didn't allow these European bumblebees to be imported for pollinating tomatoes. So companies in the US started trying to set up bee breeding facilities in the US, but they couldn't work out how to do it because it was a new kind of thing at the time. So they sent North American bumblebee queens to Europe to see if the European companies could work out how to breed them, and they sent them back. And immediately after that happened, a whole group of bumblebee species disappeared in the space of about 5 years, including the rusty patched. The habitat loss doesn't seem adequate or dramatic enough to possibly explain that sudden demise. I think the only thing that really could explain it, and it happened in remote areas far from farming as well, so it's really hard to blame on pesticides, or I think it had to be a disease. And it's the popular notion is that there was some European disease accidentally shipped from Europe with those bees. We'll never know for sure, and it's never been identified for certain what the disease was. But of course, it happened so fast that it kind of caught everyone unawares, and the bees were gone, and it was all over before anyone was really studying it. So the honest truth is we don't really know, but that's my best guess.
Thank you. Someone also wanted to know more about where they could find information about the liquid flea and tick preventatives that's used on dogs, because they'd like to incorporate that into their local sort of education campaigns. I think that's probably a new pesticide source that folks had not thought of. When I was reading your book, I was like, oh, I hadn't thought of that either.
No, even the vets prescribing them, I don't think realize that, you know, these are chemical. For example, they don't know that they're neonicotinoids, or some of them are neonicotinoids. They might have heard of neonicotinoids in farming, but I had no idea they were prescribing them to their pet owners. We published a paper, it's a scientific paper, but it's open access. The first author was my PhD student, Rosemary Perkins, and that describes the river contamination. But if you want to know more, I mean, probably the best thing is to read my book. That's the only source I can think of that explains the kind of background in a layperson kind of context. But basically, if I could just give some very quick advice, if you have a dog or cat, don't treat it prophylactically against fleas. I don't think you need to. Most dogs and cats don't have fleas. And it's like taking antibiotics to avoid getting ill. It's a really bad practice. It just leads to massive overuse of the chemical. If they do get fleas, then you've got to do something. But I think there are tablet treatments which are probably safer for the environment. There's a product called Bravecto, which I think might be better, although it hasn't been really thoroughly evaluated from an environmental perspective. But the key message is don't treat them with anything unless you actually have a problem in the first place.
Yeah, for your pets.
Yeah.
Someone asked, I think earlier on too, and this may vary between where you are and where we are, but there's a question about what you think of beekeeping as a conservation strategy. Here in North America, it's often billed that way.
Yeah, I know, and here too. And it's a joke. I mean, I'm nothing against honeybees. You know, they're really useful for pollinating some crops. And I love honey, but they're not a native species. You know, you have hundreds of native species in North America, many of which are in decline. The honeybee is not in decline globally. It's one of the most common insects on the planet, and actually the global population has increased in recent years. So there is no real crisis with honeybees. They do have health problems which are serious, and if you're a beekeeper, that is an issue. I'm not making light of that. But from a conservation and biodiversity perspective, it's a complete red herring. We should not be encouraging honeybees, not least because they compete with wild pollinators. They take the resources and they spread diseases to wild pollinators. And as I said, in case anyone's in any doubt, critically from a North American perspective, it is most definitely not a native species in North America. So yeah, I find this whole honeybee thing really frustrating. It drives me mad.
You and the question asker as well. I thought this was an interesting one, because obviously we love bugs. So this is a question about killing bugs that are not native to our location. Should we be doing that?
Do you know which bugs we're talking about? I mean,
well, for us, a big one that's now becoming a problem in the Northeast is the lanternfly. So it has become a problem because people initially introduced trees of heaven quite some time ago, which is a very important host plant for the lanternfly, but it also eats, other trees, and so it's become quite an invasive pest.
Yeah, I mean, it's really difficult, isn't it? I don't know. I mean, there's no perfect solution because once you've introduced something, it's impossible to get rid of them. And I think that's almost universally true. There's really no chance of exterminating a pest insect once it's established. So you either start, trying to control them in a way that will probably have collateral damage for other insects. Really hard to avoid that. Or you put up with them, and I mean, neither is a particularly attractive solution. Personally, I think if it's more of a problem of ornamental plants in gardens, then I wouldn't spray. I would just change the plants I grew to avoid the ones that are going to be eaten by the lantern bugs.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is really tricky. And the key thing, of course, is we should be desperately trying to avoid introducing non-native insects in the first place. But with the kind of global trade that we have in all sorts of things, it seems very hard to avoid accidentally. Well, that said, I mean, I do think the garden industry has been very irresponsible over the years in shipping plants around the world without properly quarantining them. We could definitely do a better job of reducing the number of foreign insects that come in. You know, we don't need to be importing plants across national borders, and you know, why would we do that now? We have a huge choice of plants to grow in our gardens. There is just no need for ornamental plants to be shipped in from abroad. And that would seem an obvious thing to stop, but I'm not sure anyone's going to listen to me.
That's a good idea. We have just a few minutes left, but there were sort of two similar questions that came in. Someone was asking about their own garden and kind of the biggest impact that they could have, given that they have a very small space. And someone also asked about your own garden and kind of what you try to accomplish with your own space.
Yeah, I mean, I try to get as many creatures into my garden as I possibly can, is the basic principle with native plants. But if you've got a small garden, the one thing I think I would do, certainly a small garden in the UK anyway, would be to put in a pond. Ponds are just brilliant for insect life. You know, they get colonized really quickly. You don't have to add the insects. And I know you can get issues with mosquitoes breeding in them, but I never have any particular problem. And you get dragonflies and damselflies and pond skaters and water boatmen and just this whole amazing array of aquatic insects that come in. So that would be the first thing I would do if I was trying to make a garden more wildlife friendly.
That I think is probably a good, we have just a few minutes left, so I think that's a good place to probably end the presentation. I am so appreciative of you being here, as I know all of our audience members are. Thank you so much for being a part of our presentation, and I hope we are able to hear from you again sometime soon. And for folks who don't have a copy already, Dave's book is Silent Earth, Averting the Insect Apocalypse. I reread it recently, and I just think it's an amazing and very digestible book that talks about insects in just this very appreciative and loving way, and also offers really, again, a good accessible explanation of why pesticides are a problem and the systemic ways in which our pesticide use is very broken. We have broken systems. So I encourage everyone to pick up a copy and also to buy a copy for a friend.
Can I just say, it's not all doom and gloom. It might sound like it, but the end of it is full of solutions. So
yes.
Yeah, don't give up.
It's solution oriented. So thank you for the book, and thank you for inspiring us all to do our own part. Thank you so much. And for folks whose questions I wasn't able to get to, you can email me at rosemary@nofamass.org. I'll put it in the chat quickly, and I will try to address your question. Thank you so much, Dave. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Bye, everyone.
Matt, I'm going to turn it over to you for a few last details.
Yeah, I'll just say, extend a thank you to Dave and Rosemary and Charlie. Thank you for putting this event together. This event was recorded, will be on the Cary Library YouTube channel, but I think you otherwise said everything. So thank you, and have a good day, everyone.